Hare Krishna, this is Amiyatma Das, a disciple of Srila Prabhupada. Today we're discussing the Ritvik Guru debate in ISKCON. And we're going to be pointing out some of the ways that the GBC has been wrong on this issue. So, in what ways have they been wrong? Well, what many newer members of ISKCON may not be so aware of is how the GBC has drastically changed some of their major and fundamental views on this issue over the years. In 1978 and for decades thereafter, the GBC stated as a hard and fast fact that Srila Prabhupada had appointed the first 11 men to become actual and regular gurus after he departs. They promoted that because Srila Prabhupada had appointed them to be gurus, that these 11 men were to be respected as his most advanced disciples. They were frankly Paramahamsas, pure devotees, because they had been appointed by Srila Prabhupada. And the GBC did not tolerate any at all dissension toward this so-called stated fact. And a few disciples, Prabhupada disciples, who spoke up and disagreed with the GBC, saying that Srila Prabhupada had not appointed those men to be gurus, many of them were kicked right out of Srila Prabhupada's mission. Their services had been taken away. Some of them were quite dear to Srila Prabhupada, like Pradyumna, Panditji, Prabhupada we used to call him. And yet in 1999, the GBC finally admitted that for the past 22 years at that time, they had been wrong about this. They finally admitted in 1999 that His Divine Grace had not actually appointed any of those 11 men to become actual gurus. In 1999, the GBC admitted that in 1977 and 78, they admitted that they were confused at that time about this. Yet this had been a point for decades that the GBC had taken such a hard and fisted stance to defend, ruining the spiritual lives of some of Srila Prabhupada's disciples who dared to speak up to say they were wrong. Yet in the end, the GBC had to finally admit that yes, those devotees were right, and the GBC had been wrong on such an important aspect of such an important issue as this. In 1978, when the GBC rolled out their new guru system, which was known as the zonal acharya system, the 11 new acharyas were hailed as Paramahamsas, of having achieved the topmost level of devotional service. They were even held up to the same level of Srila Prabhupada. The GBC also saw those who would dare speak up and tell others that these men were not on the highest platform. Those devotees were labeled as envious offenders. Some of them were kicked out of Srila Prabhupada's mission. By 1999, the majority of the original 11 gurus had fallen down. One had been even convicted of serious felony crimes, sent off to prison. And so also in 1999, the GBC had to finally formally admit that those 11 men had not actually been Mahabhagavats or Paramahamsas as they had originally insisted they were. Then there's the Ritvik appointment letter that Srila Prabhupada had written up in July of 1977, which is often referred to now as the July 9th letter. Srila Prabhupada had addressed that letter or document to the GBC and to the temple presidents. And he had instructed the GBC that this letter was to be mailed out to all of the temples. Many newer devotees don't realize, but the GBC in 1977 chose to blatantly and deliberately disobey that order by Srila Prabhupada. The GBC in 1977 deliberately chose not to send the letter out to the temples or temple presidents and chose to keep the letter to themselves privately. Even though ISKCON's founder Acharya, their own spiritual master, Srila Prabhupada, had ordered them to mail it out. So Why did they do that? Well, some members of the GBC felt that the letter Srila Prabhupada wrote was, well, in their view, misleading. They felt that devotees would become misled if they read the very letter that Srila Prabhupada wrote and wanted us to read at that time. Why did the GBC think like that? Well, because in that letter, Srila Prabhupada had given the names of the 11 men who he had chosen, who he had selected, to act as his Rtvik representatives. And in this letter, he clearly stated that those 11 men were to perform the initiations on his behalf, Prabhupada's behalf, where those who were initiated would become Srila Prabhupada's direct disciples. But according to the GBC, in 1977, they saw that that letter was lacking, and it was misleading because Srila Prabhupada had failed to mention anything at all about these men becoming actual gurus after he departs. Actually, in 1977, prior to the July 9th letter, back in May 28th of 1977, the GBC had held their last official meeting with Srila Prabhupada. Actually, the entire GBC didn't go because it was held in Srila Prabhupada's room, or maybe in his garden, but he was very sick. And so instead of sending all of the GBC, only 6, I think, GBC members attended the meeting. And in that meeting, they asked Srila Prabhupada, how are the initiations to be conducted after he departs, after he leaves, when he's no longer present with us? And one of the members in that meeting came out and wrote down the official notes for that meeting. And he stated, which became the official GBC record of that meeting, he stated, because the original tapes, it was recorded, but the original tape, no one made a copy. They just sent the original tapes and they went to the BBT archives. So they sat in archives for years. And no one knew exactly what Srila Prabhupada said for many years later, until many years later. But what they had was the note written down by the one GBC member, the official note. And that stated that when Prabhupada was asked that question about how initiation would be conducted when he's no longer present, that note stated that Srila Prabhupada said that he would soon select some men and they will initiate their own disciples and become regular gurus after he departs. However, that is not what he actually said. That person had become confused in that meeting, and he wrote down in the report, that is what was misleading, the GBC report. Because what Srila Prabhupada actually said when he was asked this question, what he actually answered was that he would soon select some men who would be officiating acharyas. Tamal Krishna asked, is that the Rtvik Acharya? And Srila Prabhupada said, Rtvik, yes. So Srila Prabhupada, his actual answer to that question of how initiation to be conducted when he's no longer present, is that he would soon select some men who would act as Ritviks. Yet the GBC report stated Srila Prabhupada would soon select some men who would initiate their own disciples and become actual gurus on Prabhupada's departure. So when this July 9th letter came, when Prabhupada wrote the July 9th letter, and he actually listed 11 men who Srila Prabhupada had chosen, well, the GBC men saw that list as a list of gurus, because that's what they thought Srila Prabhupada said in May, that he would soon select some men who would be actual gurus. So they saw that the July 9th letter was misleading. And that if the rest of the devotees read Srila Prabhupada's letter only, they would be thinking, oh, Prabhupada just appointed these men, these 11 men, to act as his Rtvik representatives, where those who were initiated would be Prabhupada's disciples. And they were thinking, the GBC was thinking that somehow Srila Prabhupada simply forgot to mention that these same men were to become regular gurus, the next acharyas after he departs, and that they will initiate their own disciples. So the GBC of 1977 came to the conclusion that the July 9th letter would simply mislead everyone. And if the devotees who read it would think that, they would just have the wrong idea. They wouldn't accept that those 11 men would have become actual gurus. Therefore, the GBC men of 1977 concluded that Srila Prabhupada's letter was so lacking, so misleading, so poorly written that they had to keep it private to themselves and not share it with the other devotees. And to do this, well, they would have to simply disobey Srila Prabhupada. Disobey his order that this letter be mailed out to all the temples. This, they decided, would be best for ISKCON. It will be better for ISKCON for them to disobey Prabhupada and to not let the devotees read what Srila Prabhupada wrote and intended for the devotees to read at that time. Even though this letter is where Srila Prabhupada gave the names of the 11 men that he had chosen to act as his Rtvik-Representatives, the GBC concluded that those 11 men were to become the next 11 new acharyas. So they chose to keep this letter private to themselves and not share the letter with anyone. Remember, that letter was written in July of 1977. And so in July, the GBC knew the names of the people who they thought were to become the regular gurus, but they didn't tell anybody. They didn't share that information with anyone. Now, and that was July of 1977. Now, in March of 1978, they then informed everyone that Srila Prabhupada had written a list, given a list of the 11 men, and that they were to become the next new acharyas. So that was 3 to 4 months after Srila Prabhupada had left this world, that they just sprung that on us. And it was 8 months after the letter was actually written. And still in March of 1978, while they told us there was this list where Prabhupada gave the 11 men, they still refused to share that list with us, to show us the actual July 9th letter, because the GBC knew it didn't state that anywhere in that letter that they were to be gurus, and so they were thinking that letter would just mislead everyone. But who was being misled with the GBC? Prabhupada never said he was going to select men who would be regular gurus. He said he would soon select some men who would be Ritviks. That was his answer to their question as to how initiation would be conducted in the future when he's no longer present. Now, the GBC did not only just ban this one letter, but after Srila Prabhupada departed, and so many devotees, the BBT were asking for all the devotees to send, because when Prabhupada would send them the letter, they would have the letter, but it wasn't in the BBT archives. So the request went out for everyone to send their letters, or at least a copy of the letters, their letters that they received from Prabhupada, to the BBT. And that's where the BBT started getting their archive of the letters that devotees would send in, their original or a copy. And but then the GBC decided that all of Prabhupada's letters must be banned and kept private and not be shared with the devotees. So not just the July 9th letter. Then they banned all of Prabhupada's letters. So for many years, no one outside of the GBC ever got to see or read the actual July 9th letter or document itself. Then in 1985, a devotee he wanted to do his own research. Actually, his wife, that devotee was a disciple of Prabhupada, but his wife was a new devotee, and she decided she wanted to take initiation from Kirtanananda. Well, this devotee, her husband, had heard some good things, but some bad things about Kirtanananda. And he had heard that Prabhupada had written some letters to Kirtanananda which were not very flattering. So he just wanted to see those letters so he could help his wife in making the right decision, so she wouldn't select, someone who was not really qualified. He just wanted to make sure. So he knew someone and asked if they could get a copy of Prabhupada's letters out from the BBT. This was in 1985. By 1985, the BBT were archiving, they had archived all of Srila Prabhupada's letters on microfilm. A small film, but the images would be shrunk down by photographic process, and a whole page would be put on just like a quarter of an inch or so. So there was these microfilm and microfilm readers, and so a devotee, agreed that he smuggled out a copy of Prabhupada's letters on these microfilm and gave to this devotee. Sulochan was his name. So Sulochan got a copy of all of Srila Prabhupada's letters so he could just do his own research to see if his wife, was making the right selection for Kirtanananda to be her guru. As Sulochan went through the letters, he found the July 9th letter. And he saw that in that letter, Srila Prabhupada had said nothing at all of these men ever becoming actual gurus. Srila Prabhupada had only named them to become Ritviks, and he very clearly explained that the disciples would be Srila Prabhupada's. So this devotee came to the conclusion that the GBC had been lying to all of us. Now, he came to a little bit more dark conclusion, but it was based on the fact that the GBC they kept this document private, and then it didn't say what they had been saying it said. All these years they said that Srila Prabhupada had appointed them to be regular gurus. The document doesn't say that. So this devotee jumped to the conclusion that the GBC had been lying to us just so they could become gurus, and so he started writing a book. But he also began to pass out copies of Srila Prabhupada's letters, and this one included the July 9th letter. Well, the GBC was not happy about this. One or more of the GBC then put a bounty on his head, on Sulochan. And Sulochan was murdered. Sitting in his motorhome, defenseless, he was shot in the head and killed. He was a Prabhupada disciple. And the devotee who killed him was paid $8,000 for his services of murdering a defenseless disciple of Srila Prabhupada. Yet due to the efforts of Sulochan, the July 9th letter started to become circulated around. Devotees started making copies and passing it around. Now there's a lot more to this history, but the point I was trying to make is that the GBC have not always been on the right side of this issue. In fact, they pretty much have been on the wrong side of the issue the whole time. They had taken very strong, harsh stands on major aspects of this issue, which wound up ruining or disrupting the spiritual lives of a number of Srila Prabhupada's disciples. Then decades later, they admitted, well, guess what? We'd been wrong all that time. The July 9th letter was the only document that Srila Prabhupada had written on the topic of initiations since after he had announced that he would be leaving this world soon, back on May 16th of 1977. And yet the GBC blatantly, they just blatantly disobeyed Srila Prabhupada's order to them, or instruction that this letter be mailed out to all the temples. The GBC decided that they knew better than Srila Prabhupada. I mean, Srila Prabhupada wrote this letter that was just totally misleading, and the GBC knew better. And so to protect the ISKCON movement from Srila Prabhupada, the GBC decided it would be best just to keep that letter private, not let devotees read what Srila Prabhupada wrote. Because if they read what Srila Prabhupada wrote, it could destroy Prabhupada's mission. This logic by the GBC, it's offensive. It's convoluted. It's backwards. In that online presentation, I give much more information. I actually share with you the report from the May 28th meeting and how comparing that word by word with what Prabhupada actually said, because we had the recordings. It's just that they didn't have access to the recording at that time, because only one recording was made on a reel-to-reel deck, and that was sent to the archives, and it wasn't put on the tape ministry because it wasn't a philosophical lecture. It was just a meeting. Tapes like that weren't put out on the ministry, so no copies were made for many years. So, but we compare what Prabhupada actually said with what whoever wrote that GBC report, which I think was Satsarup, and we compare and we can see that report is what was misleading. And it had misled the GBC members so that when the July 9th letter came out, they assumed that Prabhupada's letter was so misleading when it was they who had been misled by the GBC report. Anyway, as I said, I have given much more clearer explanation of this and give all the actual evidence in the full presentation. So please, to understand this issue more, please watch the full presentation. The link is given below in the description below. All right?